I didn't even get his name, the name of my Good Samaritan. In December of 2003, I was driving from Cincinnati, Ohio, down through the mountains of West Virginia to McDowell County. I was going to be the keynote speaker at the conclusion of a mission trip, Operation Warm Up, that I had been to before that I thought was terrific. Now, this is a pitch black night. I'm driving alone. I don't even know exactly where I am, but I know I'm on the right road according to my atlas, and I'm making my way down through these curvy mountain roads. And instead of driving over some railroad tracks, I drove onto them and got my car stuck on the rails. Now, what made me break out into a sweat and made my heart beat out of my chest was that just a half an hour down the road, a bunch of trains had passed me. And so I was terrified. And out of nowhere, a Good Samaritan comes on the scene. Now, I have no cell phone reception. I don't know exactly where I am. I can barely see anything, and I don't know anybody. And yet this man in this small blue pickup truck, he comes by and he says, "Look, I'm happy to pull you off the train tracks. I've got some chains here." He said, "But if I hear a train, you're on your own." Well, I was like, "Hey, let's get it going, man." And so he hooked it up to my car and he pulled it right off the tracks. The car was fine, and I was able to eventually get to my destination late that night. But the man didn't accept anything from me, didn't expect anything in return for his good deed. God bless that Good Samaritan wherever he is. Hi, my name's Keith, and I want to speak to you about one of Jesus's most well-known parables. This is the parable of the Good Samaritan. You could probably go just about anywhere in the world today and ask somebody, "Hey, can you tell me something about this parable?" And probably people would speak with a high level of confidence about lessons to be learned from the parable. They might not be familiar with all the characters in the parable. They might not even know the sequence of events, but they could probably tell you the gist of what this parable is all about. They might say something like, "Look, the world would be a much better place if all of us were willing to be a Good Samaritan." And you might kind of ask them to unpack that, explain that a little bit more. They might say something to the effect of, "Well, a Good Samaritan is a person who lends aid, who provides assistance for somebody who cannot help themselves, somebody who's in a real jam and needs some desperate help." Some people might actually add to that and say, a Good Samaritan is somebody who doesn't expect to be repaid for what he or she actually does for that individual in need. Another person might even add further to that by saying, one of the things that makes this story so remarkable is that the Good Samaritan has no connection with, no relationship with a person that they provide help for. And that's what makes this so incredible. They're not obligated to help, but they choose to help. And look, all those truths are correct about this parable that Jesus told. And yet, if we're not familiar with the specific dynamics about the story, the context as to why Jesus actually told the story, we're not going to be able to appreciate the depths and the richness and get a more fuller understanding of this amazing, memorable parable. I would also hasten to add that by reading this parable in Luke chapter 10, in the Gospel of Luke, you're also going to learn something about the person who told the parable, and that's Jesus Christ. Now, I want you to go through a little bit of an exercise for me, something that you probably haven't done before, but humor me on this, okay? I want you to imagine the setting in which Jesus told this parable. What comes to your mind? Maybe work with your imagination a little bit. You probably picture Jesus on a grassy hillside and he's teaching. You probably see crowds of people who are huddled together, smiling, maybe even sharing some things with each other, and they're enraptured with the teaching of Jesus. They're just kind of leaning into every word that he says. You could probably hear birds chirping in the background. And when Jesus takes a break, maybe a young man pulls out an acoustic guitar and people start just spontaneously singing praises to the Lord. Maybe they're singing something like Day by Day that you hear in Godspell, something like that. But you probably get an overall impression, and that is that when Jesus told this parable, maybe his greatest hits, maybe his best teaching, it probably looked a lot like that, where it was tranquil, all was well, there was peace. But in actual fact, if you look at much of Jesus' teaching, it wasn't like that at all. There were people that were examining Jesus. There were some people that were hostile towards Jesus. And when we look in this particular parable, we find that Jesus is having a private moment with his disciples, and he's interrupted by someone who has ill intentions towards Jesus Christ. And he finds himself in a pressure cooker situation where someone is trying to destroy his credibility. Well, let me go ahead and get you caught up to what's been going on before this parable is told. Jesus is having this private moment with his disciples. He has sent out pairs of 35 of his followers to go out to the different towns that he would eventually go to, and he has deputized them to go do ministry in his name, to heal people, to talk to people about the kingdom of God. And they're coming back, and they're very, very excited. And Jesus wants them to understand that they're very blessed. There have been many people who've come before them that would have loved to have seen and heard what they have seen and heard. So they're actually in a very privileged position. Now, into this moment steps a scribe, a lawyer, as it's mentioned in verse 25. A lawyer stands up and interrupts this private moment. Well, we've had a little bit of foreshadowing in the previous chapter in verse 22. And the scribes are a part of a larger group that is actually going to reject Jesus. So that lets us know that this encounter is probably not going to be a very welcome encounter. When you see the word lawyer, you probably think about an attorney, but that's actually something different. Okay, these scribes, these lawyers, these teachers of law, all those terms are used interchangeably in Luke's gospel, but they refer to the same person, an expert in the Old Testament law. These are like the PhDs of that society, the most educated individuals. Anybody could be one if they could get the education. And that's what we have here about to challenge Jesus Christ. Now, one of the things that I would offer to you is to think of this as a fight. So when we think about this as a fight, we need to keep this in mind. When most people want to fight, they seldom walk right up to a person and assault them. That's not what usually happens. Normally, they pick a fight. They try to find some area of disagreement, and they escalate the situation and use that area of disagreement as a pretext to justify the fight. Now, this lawyer is not going to actually physically attack Jesus Christ. No, he actually wants to do something far more damaging to Jesus. It was very common in the Greco-Roman world, but we also see it in the Jewish world. We see many of these instances in the New Testament in which people will publicly debate each other. And this is an honor and shame culture. And so the winner, who bests his opponent, is actually going to do some serious damage to that person's credibility. And that person is going to be left in a situation where not many people are going to want to know what they think. Not many people are going to want to go and follow them. And consequently, the one who wins the exchange is going to be seen as more honorable, as somebody who's smarter, who has greater prestige that people want to listen to. And so this lawyer moves forward, not in a situation where he recognizes that Jesus is a great teacher, though he does address him respectfully as a teacher. What he wants to do, okay, is get into a verbal fight with Jesus, and this will probably, or at least he wants, to damage Jesus's credibility on the law and be able to peel away Jesus's disciples and keep them from following after him. That's what's going on. They're not trying to meld together their minds and work through things together, seeking truth. Oh no, oh no. This lawyer is coming after Jesus and wants to take him down. Luke chapter 10, beginning in verse 25. And a lawyer stood up and put him to the test, saying, "Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?" Well, that's a pretty fantastic question. It's a question that many people in Israel were asking at that time, and he puts it to Jesus. How does Jesus respond? Verse 26. And he said to him, "What is written in the law? How does it read to you?" Basically saying, okay, we're on common ground here. We both respect the role of the Old Testament law in society today. Okay, what's your interpretation of it? And we come across that term for the law. We could be thinking of it as the Mosaic Law, the collection of the laws that God gave to the children of Israel in Mount Sinai. But it can also refer to the first 5 books of the Bible, called the Pentateuch. So any answer that Jesus or this lawyer gives that is found in those first 5 books of the Bible is going to be on sure footing. And so Jesus is used to debating, and so he turns the tables on him. Hey, look, you're the one who's coming to challenge me. Okay, why don't you get us started? Why don't you state your position? And hey, I'll shoot holes in it if I disagree with it. And so the lawyer is okay with that. So he proceeds to answer his own question in verse 27. And he answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." He's taken all this law and he's distilled it down into 2 verses. The first one is in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 5, and the part about loving your neighbor as yourself, that's found in Leviticus chapter 19, verse 17. Now look, it's not important. I think a lot of people want to kind of parse out and say, what does it mean to love God with my heart? What does it mean to love him with my soul and with my mind? Yeah, that's fine. But I think the gist of what that verse is saying is that we are to love God in the fullness of who we are, in totality. That is how we are to love him, without reservation, with all that we have. That is what that verse means. And this is actually a response that Jesus is very impressed with. He says in verse 28, "You have answered correctly. Do this and you will live." Well, this probably came as a bit of a surprise to this lawyer. I mean, what is he there for? He's there for a fight. He's there to take Jesus down. That's what he wants to do. And so what does he find? He finds, oh, well, this is not what I thought. I mean, we're in agreement here. He likes my answer. He thinks it's correct. Well, how are we going to fight? And so he doesn't want to walk away, shake hands with Jesus, and everything be okay. He wants to go further. He's coming after Jesus. So verse 29, "But wishing to justify himself, he said to Jesus, 'And who is my neighbor?'" The legal expert wants to know who is his neighbor. And when you unpack that question, what he really wants to know is who isn't his neighbor. That's what's going on at the foundational presuppositional level there. He wants to know the limits of who he should show love and care and compassion for. I misspoke just a moment ago when I mentioned Leviticus 19:17. I meant to say Leviticus 19:18. That's where it says that we should love our neighbors as ourselves. and this legal expert and Jesus are in agreement that those who are loving their neighbors as themselves have their lives oriented towards eternal life. They are in agreement on that. But again, this legal expert wants to know, who do I not have to show love for? Jesus, when he tells the parable, he does not answer the question. And this shouldn't surprise us because Jesus has answered that question before. If you go back to Luke chapter 6, you can find that Jesus commands his followers to love their enemies. So if you love your enemies, it takes dynamite and blows up the boundaries. So if we're going to show love for our enemies, we should be able to show love for all people. And so Jesus moves things in a different direction by telling this parable. He's going to make a few points. One of those is to provide a concrete example of what loving your neighbor looks like. Number two, he's going to show the importance of having integrity, taking your belief and putting it into actual practice. That is something that we're going to see shine through in this parable. I'm just going to read it to you. It's very, very short, and then provide a few concluding remarks. Verse 30, Jesus replied and said, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among robbers. And they stripped him and beat him and went away, leaving him half dead. And by chance, a priest was going down on the road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. Likewise, a Levite also, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan who was on a journey came upon him, and when he saw him, he felt compassion and came to him and bandaged up his wounds, pouring oil and wine on them. And he put him on his own beast and brought him to an inn and took care of him. On the next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper and said, 'Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, when I return, I will repay you.'" Thus concludes the parable. Just want to mention a few things here. Number one, Jesus is brilliant. He is an incredible storyteller. He tells us nothing about the man who's left half dead. All we know is that he's a certain man. We know nothing because we have no details to know whether we would have any affinity for him, whether we would have any common ground, anything that would quickly move us to want to provide assistance for him. All we know is that he's a man in desperate need, been left half dead. We would expect that the priest, we would expect the Levite, these Jews, to get it right, to be the heroes in the story. But in fact, they're not. We know that the priest is going down, so he's leaving Jerusalem and he's headed away from Jericho. Presumably, he's finished his priestly duties. Now, some would want to say that both the priest and the Levite don't want to get near this man because they would defile themselves or make themselves ceremonially unclean. Now, maybe that's true. I don't find that particularly persuasive, okay, because they are moving away from Jerusalem. In addition to that, even priests had an obligation to respect a dead body and provide them burial. You're just not going to leave another human being created in the image of God, leaving them out as a carcass to be picked over by birds and wild animals and things like that. That just doesn't work out that way. We don't know exactly why, but the critical detail that we find is that neither of them provide the life-giving assistance that this man needs. Who gets it right? Who is the hero in the story? It's actually the Samaritan. And by knowing that the hero is a Samaritan, we get some important details from him. We know that the Samaritans and the people of Israel had a strong dislike for each other. Some would even say that they hated each other, which is a shame because they had so many things in common. Number one, they believed in one God, and they believed the same thing about that God, that God was Yahweh, and they worshiped him alone. In addition to that, they respected and saw authoritative as the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. They celebrated the same feasts, the same festivals, and had the same religious observances. So they have a lot in common, and would presumably recognize Leviticus 19:18 as authoritative, that they should love their neighbor as their self. And we see that this Samaritan is the one who gets it right. He's probably a merchant. He's got no other reason why he should be moving up to Jerusalem, but he sees the man and he gives the man life-giving assistance. Now, both the priest, the Levite, and the Samaritan, because they believed the same thing, okay, they were both in a position to provide what was needed. But only that Samaritan had that integrity of belief and behavior. Now, I want to finish off here in verse 36. Jesus asks a question. Which of these 3 do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell into the robber's hands? Checkmate. Jesus has got him. Jesus is going to win this debate, and he's going to gain esteem. Okay, he's not going to lose it. Verse 37. This is how the scribe, the legal expert, responds. And he said, the one who showed mercy toward him. Then Jesus said to him, go and do the same. Jesus' parting words to the legal expert are actually a challenge to all of us today who would profess that Jesus is Lord, would seek to actually follow after him. It is a challenge for us to not simply consider what we believe, make sure that our beliefs are correct and orthodox, but to make sure that we are putting them into practice, that our beliefs actually translate into behavior. Because if we don't live out what we believe, people would be justified in questioning whether or not we actually genuinely believe what we profess to believe. God bless you.